Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. And I'm going to say his name again, Chinua Achebe. And if you're used to speaking Spanish, or if you know how to pronounce Spanish, um, hang on, my hair looks kind of crazy there. All right. If you know how to pronounce Spanish vowels, and generally speaking Spanish pronunciation, you'll be great with pronouncing essentially Igbo words, and a good deal. Same if you were in Kenya, um, similar kind of intonation with um, Kenyan English. But anyway, that's in East Africa. We're in West Africa, in Nigeria, and we're reading basically the most famous African novel still to this day. It was first published in 1958, um, and kind of really captured the zeitgeist, of the time. Colonialism, European colonialism, was falling apart in, if you'll forgive the phrase, in Africa and around the world. And here comes this novel just as that's happening. So he was kind of in the right place at the right time, I suppose. But it's also brilliantly written, and it's a great novel. As usual, jealous of you if you've never read it, that you get to read it for the first time. Anyway, um, nice picture on the right. I think that's one of the early cover pieces of art for his novel. And I guess also that cover here, I'm putting my cursor over it, gives you a sense maybe of. Um, we're going to meet characters called Igwugus in this novel who are kind of spiritual leaders, and they often wear masks. And the design of these masks seems to indicate something like, if these are masks, they look a bit like masks, then perhaps that's reminding us of that aspect of the novel. Anyway, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Next slide. I like this photo. Usually, when you see Achebe's photo, you see kind of more recent Achebe, when he had become a kind of elder statesman of literature, and he often wears a beret. And you may have seen him with that photo. Here's kind of the young man who wrote this novel. This was his first novel, Things Fall Apart. First novel he had published. He's from Nigeria, which is in West Africa. It was a British colony until it was became independent in 1960. So one of the earlier one, well, the earliest, I suppose, is India, not in Africa, duh. But India was in 1947, which was sort of the beginning of the end of European colonialism. But a lot of the African colonies, late 50s, early 60s. Kenya's 1963, and Nigeria 1960. He was keenly aware of his British audience. Achebe, in fact, his first publisher was from in London. I think it was Heinemann, can't remember. And it is undoubtedly still the most famous African novel. I forgot to say his dates. Born in 1930, died in 2013. I think he was living in America at the time. The last couple of decades of his life, he was teaching on the East Coast of the USA. So you can see he was only 28 when this novel was first published. Let's talk about colonialism. Some of you may or may not know what that means. First bullet point here, it's a feature of imperialism. You may have heard of that term. Imperialism is kind of the theory, and colonialism is the practice. It's the practice of carrying out this imperialistic mission usually we're talking about European countries, although today people talk about economic colonialism, or economic imperialism, and they talk about the USA as exacting that kind of imperialism. by having companies in place in developing countries and then exerting power, I suppose, over countries' governments through that economic power. But that's another subject for another day. When we're talking here about European late 19th century through 20th century colonialism, in the African context specifically, a nice map of Africa over here, older map, and you can see the pictures here of some of the colonies. I'll talk about that in a minute. But we talk about the scramble for Africa. This is a term that's become applied to countries like Britain and France and Italy and Germany and Holland and Spain, I think, too. And essentially, it's a bit of, I guess I'm simplifying, perhaps I'm not really simplifying. They carved up Africa between them, particularly after a conference in Berlin in the late 19th century. But anyway, these colonial powers justified their actions through kind of narrative of civilization. These places are, they would use words like dark or backwards or, uncivilized. And we need to bring them civilization. We need to bring them education. We need to bring them government. We need to bring them law. And of course, we need to bring them Christianity. Or essentially, pretty much the religion that was brought to Africa was Christianity. And British colonialism, of course, that was definitely the case. Now, sometimes the missionaries, quite often they were there first before the government guys and the business people, particularly deeper into the continent. And sometimes the missionaries actually came into sort of conflict with the government guys and the business guys. But generally speaking, it all kind of went hand in hand. And obviously there's clear contradictions and ironies between this sort of, we're here to help you. But of course, next bullet point, really, of course, what was going on was a thorough exploitation of the resources of these countries for things that European countries needed and now could get cheap. So, for example, in the Belgian Congo, which is this big yellow bit here, lots of ivory from elephant tusks and lots of rubber would be going back to Europe from this place. And these kinds of resources, metals, ivory, rubber, certain kinds of crops, tea, coffee, these would be going back to Europe. And of course, enslavement of people or exploitation of them in terms of pay and so on. Most of these African countries were colonized in around, as I said before, about 1890, and colonialism ended pretty much late 50s, early 60s in most cases. And just if you want the precise date, Nigerian independence, and Nigeria, by the way, is right here, next to Ghana, another British colonial power. Nigerian independence is 1st of October. This is American style dates here. So October the 1st, 1960. Okay, this is I'm sorry. This is a post-colonial novel. Maybe one of the most famous post-colonial novels. Here's a long but good definition of post-colonial from the British Academy's website. A possible working definition for post-colonialism is that it involves a studied engagement with the experience of colonialism and its past and present effects, both at the local level of ex-colonial societies and at the level of more general global developments thought to be the after effects of empire. Post-colonialism often also involves the discussion of experiences such as slavery, migration, suppression, resistance, difference, race, gender, and place, as well as responses to the discourses of imperial Europe, such as history, philosophy, anthropology, and linguistics. The term is as much about conditions under imperialism and colonialism proper as about conditions coming after the historical end of colonialism. So one takeaway from that is that post-colonialism isn't just sort of after the colonial powers leave. It also involves before, and kind of the effects of colonialism, kind of at the end of colonialism, and then afterwards as well. I think this is a small bullet point at the end, but important. Even though Achebe is writing in not in his tribal language Igbo, but in English, he kind of makes it his own. And this is a whole interesting area of like what language African writers write in. There's has been some debate over the years about whether African writers should write in their own language. I mean, they themselves disagree about it. But Achebe has always, I think, taken the view that he can make English his, he can wield it as a weapon, if you like. And he makes, through the rhythms, just notice the rhythms of English. They don't sound traditionally English. It sounds different. It sounds like, in a way, what he's trying to do is sound like a kind of an Igbo English, a kind of an African English. And of course, he also uses dialect words as well. Well, let's talk about that a bit. Here's some things to look out for in Achebe's novel. First of all, he uses words from his tribal group. Achebe is from the Igbo group, one of the best known, the biggest groups in tribe is the traditional word, I suppose, or the older word. Many African countries, this is the case where you have lots of different tribal groups in the same country. He expresses a kind of pride or validity in his own culture by using those words. And go look, and there's a couple of pages of glossary in the back of your book where you can look up what those words mean. They're usually in italics. Look out for another kind of feature of Igbo culture, which is traditional oral storytelling. So lots of people telling stories and parables, but he also evokes that by making the structure of the novel a bit kind of repetitive. And so the narrator kind of repeats things. And he's doing that on purpose to remind us that this comes from an oral storytelling culture. Okay? He's not just repeating himself, right? This is all, there's a point to this. Look out for particularly in part one, and here's an interesting question: when does part one take place in history? It's actually quite a difficult question to answer. Look out, there's 2 or 3 tiny clues that you might notice as you read it. But it's actually quite difficult to say, is it 1600? Is it 1300? Is it 1800? Who knows? Look out for the natural rhythms of everyday Igbo life. When people meet each other, there's a kind of ceremony to it, particularly when they go to each other's houses or huts, involving pepper and kola nut. And tribal gatherings and rituals are very much part of this culture. And they always seem to follow kind of the same kind of rhythms. Of course, everything revolves around planting crops. You know, it's no grocery store. You've got to grow your own stuff. So planting crops is crucial. The weather is crucial. Climate is crucial. Noticing the climate is really important. And behaving appropriately at appropriate times a year. And eating food, of course, becomes really important in that sort of situation too, where you can't just go around the corner and get yourself some fast food. Making food, the kinds of food you can make at the certain times of year. Some things are available, other things are not available. So look out for that, those kind of natural rhythms. And of course, finally, really big subject for conversation is gender, particularly masculinity. Igbo traditional culture is deeply patriarchal, and this may come as, I don't know how it will come across to you. I guess it depends on your background, but Okonkwo, the main character, is a kind of traditionally kind of super masculine character, and he's actually kind of a little obsessed about his masculinity. Other male characters in the novel notice this too, so it's not just him. So notice that and compare him with his dad and his son. The whole idea of masculinity and what men can do and women do is very interesting. All right, great. Enjoy the novel, and I'll see you soon.